who else would like to see a regime change in the Middle East? Because some will say there's a business model for the Middle East being chaotic, right? And when I say regime change in the Middle East, I mean regime change in Iran specifically. But there are certain people that would like to see chaos continue in the Middle East. It's a business model, whether it's what Eisenhower said at the end of his, term, hey, be careful with the military-industrial complex that we're constantly going to war, and everybody was like, well, Biden's the one that's pulling troops out. We're no longer going to be in Afghanistan. He's the president of peace. Look who he is. And then Biden became the president where tyrants and bullies woke up. And next thing you know, you have Russia, Ukraine. You have Hamas, what they did to Israel. And then back and forth now, Israel attacking Palestine. And, what's going on with Iran getting involved. They're already involved proxy, but Hezbollah and all these other guys getting involved. Turkey's now saying, you better not cross the line. Taiwan's on the other side saying, wait a minute, what are we going to be doing? Who doesn't want to see Iran go through a regime change, and who would like to see Iran go through a regime change aside from its people? I'm talking others.
Well, without getting into potentially some conspiracy theory type arguments, I would say that there are certain companies, including oil companies in this country, are already investing a lot in R&D in alternative energies and renewable energies, albeit that there are oil companies that depend on the existing thing, or companies like General Dynamics that knows that besides building fighter planes, there are other products that they could manufacture that will have a market for in these regions. So we're not in that sort of industrial war machine only thinking in terms of guns and weapons. And I think that the population in these countries who until now had less of a say in terms of what is being decided at the very top, are more into the game in some countries that are now beginning to show more direction that gets people more involved into the argument. Case in point, Saudi Arabia. Whatever is the perspective of the current governance of Saudi Arabia, is it going in the wrong direction? No, I think it's going in the correct direction, which explains why in this whole Abraham Accords, you had the interest of some of the key countries in the Arab world going along with that flow, because they saw the light of the opportunities that you now see in Dubai, that you see in other countries. And then you have frustrated Iraqis or Iranians or Syrians who are looking at that and say, we want to be part of that opportunity for change. But they're trapped behind the alliance of resistance against that alliance for progress. It's a little bit like the way the people behind the Iron Curtain were envying the opportunities on the other side of the wall. This is the dynamic. So is chaos conducive to that growth? No, I think today it's more regional cooperation. We were talking earlier about intelligence agencies or whatever is now, let's say what the Mossad does or Al-Mukhabarat does or whatever does. But imagine that we could have just as much as Europe today in the context of the EU or, for instance, NATO have their own arrangements. Why couldn't we replicate and have something similar in the Middle East, where countries in the region have joint security arrangements, military alliances? Because I think that liberates us from putting far too much of our national budget into military infrastructure and rather have that money spent on education, on welfare, on healthcare, things of that nature, as opposed to the annual security and military budget that we would have to independently have if we don't work together. Therefore, that theory of creating chaos may have worked in the 20th century, but I don't think it's a direction that we would like to have our countries in the region go. I mean, I would be, at least if I were to represent the argument on behalf of my compatriots, say, whether I'm talking to the Israelis or to the Saudis or whoever else in the region, look, we can only stand to benefit from it if we create an opportunities for economic growth for all of us. If there are enough Iranians invested in Egypt and Egyptians invested in Saudi Arabia or Saudi Arabia invested in, people of that region will demand stability. And no foreign power, regardless of its industries, can disturb that, because you are not dealing not with a few leaders at the top that make the decisions. We're dealing with about 300 or 400 million people who live in that area resisting that sort of imposition. That's the nature of the game. So I mean, obviously, we can't guarantee that those who will think differently may want to try and attempt to force again that scenario. But it's very different than before. Before, most of the people in the region will not have a say in this debate. But if they say, wait a second, it is our assets, it's our properties, it's our economic interests, they will in fact demand their respective governments to maintain that situation. So I don't think that the dynamics in the 21st century resemble anything like what we saw in the latter part of the 20th century. Some of the rules have changed. I'm not saying that those problems have totally dissipated. I'm not saying that we are out of the woods yet. But I think that if we look from that prism, that if the behavior is commitment to religious cooperation, regional cooperation, it is committed to working with as opposed to against each other, that it's a collective benefit as opposed to a zero-sum game. It is not this camp or that camp. Of course, you have to create that vision. And I think that vision is through dialogue. And the more we have dialogue among our nations, the better we can achieve that. Because all those predispositions that existed in the past, whether you are anti-Arab or anti-Israel or whatever, this is based on what? Is it based on correct information, or is it based on a certain mindset that was cultivated or built by certain narratives or certain ideological pressures? I think in a realistic, free world, when debate and discussion is open and transparent, those kind of ideologies that tend to radicalize people or mount them in an attitude of being anti-something to justify your own ends, we can reverse that, or we can at least eliminate that. That my gain doesn't have to be your loss. Mm-hmm. That I don't have to necessarily say, what's in my national interest or my national identity by having to be anti-Arab, let's say, or anti-this or anti-that. That's really my approach and my philosophy. I may be, from the point of view of some, maybe naive or maybe simple-minded, but I think we ought to give this process a chance in our region, which never has had so far the opportunity to experiment.
It's tough to negotiate with unreasonable people.